audience, and welcome to my panelists to this panel entitled Crossing Genres with Horror Hybrids. I'm Sean Duke. I'm your moderator and one of the hosts and producers of the Skiffy and Fanny Show. I am joined today by three lovely folks, Caitlin Starling, Johnny J, and Susan Palumbo, who I will give it just a second to introduce themselves. Before that, just a reminder for folks who are in watching at this moment, you can leave questions in the chat or on the Discord. We are in Bartholomew, so if you would like to leave, I'm monitoring both, but please use that if you're there. So before we get onto the topic itself, I'd like to, if we could, have folks introduce themselves. So Susan, who are you?
Oh boy, that's an existential question. Who am I? Who am I for this panel? For this panel, I am Susan Palumbo, and I am a dark fantasy horror, primarily short story writer. I'm trying or about to start trying to get into the long fiction life because my novella is going on sub next week. But I have stories out in various dark fantasy and horror venues such as The Dark and Pseudopod and Undertow's Weird Horror, among others. This year, which was exciting and also a surprise, I'm nominated for the Nebula for short story for Laughter Among the Trees, which is a horror story, that was really exciting to get a horror story on the Nebula list. I was really like, yay. Other than that, I also do quite a bit of community work. I work with Fiacon. I am the co-awards admin for the Ignite Awards, so I help organize and run that and write the script and all of those things. And if you want to learn more about that, you should go to, I believe it's Fiacon, violetmag.com or something like that. You can look it up. And yeah, and that's about it. I'll keep it at that. That's who I am.
Perfect. That's who you are. Awesome. Johnny, what about you? Who are you?
Well, I used to be known as the brown ball of fury, but after about 3 years of being indoors, I am now the beige ball of fury. So I've lost my melanin. But, we adjust. But I'm the founder of A Tribe Called Geek, which is a media platform for Indigenous geek culture and, well, basically just pop culture in general. But I'm also one of the co-founders of Not Your Mascots and Live Indigenous Okay. And I am the host of Whistling in the Night, which is kind of like a Twitter space for the strange and unusual, where we share real life paranormal experiences. We talk about UFOs and Sasquatch, and we talk about a lot about like cultural too, like our kind of like our cultural horror icons, and we bring in stories that we have in our different tribes, and we talk about how they're similar, how they're different, and it's been a really unique experience just to see how entrenched we really are in horror, which, most people just know me for a lot of like the media work that I do and a lot of the social justice work that I do. And they don't really get to see this horror fanatic side of me. So, and I've been really excited over the last couple of years that I've been able to get my feet back into what my real passion is, which is horror. And, I also peddle a great presentation called Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse Res Style. So I like to peddle that up and down the coast because, if zombies are out and about, Indigenous people, we're the people to come to.
Awesome. Thank you, Johnny. And then lastly, Caitlin, who are you? Who are you really?
I am a novelist, primarily specializing in horror. My most recent book is The Death of Jane Lawrence, but most relevant to today's panel is probably my first novel, which is The Luminous Dead, which was sci-fi horror, angry, traumatized lesbians in a cave, psychosocial drama, fun stuff. I also have written nonfiction for a variety of venues, like I've had a piece in Nightmare, I've had a piece in Uncanny, and in fact, I had a piece come out with Torn Night Fire blog that was specifically about what I've learned in the process of constantly writing horror hybrids of sci-fi horror or fantasy horror, secondary world horror, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Fantastic. So to get us started with the simple question, which is about the title of this panel, when it comes to the idea of genre bending and horror in particular, bending that with other genres, what does that really mean to you as a creative? What's a great example that you would kind of point to other than your own work? Because I think everybody's kind of pointed to some of their own already. I'll go the same order if we don't mind, and then I'll break it up and kind of go different ways. So Susan, what do you think?
Sorry, the question was in terms of this panel, right?
Yeah, like what is genre bending with horror? How do you kind of feel about what does that mean to you?
Okay, so I find this a very interesting question because I feel like horror is so based in emotion and so based in feeling and tone and mood that it is quite different from a lot of other genres in which often have specific sort of structures or specific sort of tropes or things that you start off with and people can recognize them very very quickly and the thing that I like about horror is that it's not necessarily that you bend horror. It's that horror is so scalable. It's as large as the cosmos and it's as tiny as a sliver in your finger. And because of that sort of malleability of horror and where you can fit it in and that scalability, it's not just a scalability on the like largesse and the minute scale. It's also an internal and an external sort of thing going on. And because of those different variables, it's very three-dimensional and you can stick it into almost any genre you want. You could put it with sci-fi, you could put it with fantasy. I actually really love dark comedies. I find them really difficult to write because you're dealing with two different emotions at this and you have to balance them. But yeah, that's what it means to me. It's not necessarily a genre bending. It's I can suffuse this with horror, or I can insert horror at different places because horror is so the word I used was malleable. And so you asked for examples. So I'm going to go on. I love gothic romance, but I'm going to try and be different today because I'm trying to expand my horizons. I find that you often, when you read in short stories, at least, you find a lot of cosmic horror that goes off in funny tropes. So like right now, I believe on Pseudopod, there is a John Wiswell has something, I think it's called Your Tentacle and You. And, you know, tentacles are usually the realm of cosmic horror, but he's made it funny. And I find also the film Ready or Not, that's so graphically violent, but it also was hilarious to me. So those are some of the examples of sort of genre bending.
Awesome. Thank you very much. What about you, Johnny? How do you kind of approach this?
I agree with Susan because, horror is just so versatile and there's no one definition of horror. We typically think of it as, like monsters and ghosts and, things like that. But for example, Titanic was terrifying to me. Like that's a horror film for me because I'm scared of water. And it's just my greatest fear would be to get on a cruise ship and thinking, oh, I'm going on a vacation or this is luxury. And then you hit an iceberg and you're out in the middle of the ocean. There's no help for you. It's cold, it's certain doom. So like that's horror to me. And we all have our own idea and fears that really speak to us on different levels. So, I really love that horror is so versatile. Like you could do historical horrors and, it could be about specific historical events because those are horrors and atrocities that different people have gone through. So their perspectives are very different on them. So I really love, like Jordan Peele's like Get Out, playing with the idea of horror and racism, for example. And then, but for me, like my favorite is when we mix horror and comedy because I love dark comedies. I have a really morbid sense of humor. It's just a native thing. Um, when I talk about morbid and death, because a lot of people with our funerals are a little unsettled if they've never come to a native funeral because we usually sit with the body for in my tribe 3 days and somebody is always with the body. but instead of mourning and a lot of tears, you'll be in there and you'll be hearing laughter and people just visiting and talking. And they're a little unsettled because for them funerals are supposed to be somber, and you're supposed to be mourning, and we are. But natives, we've really learned to kind of cope with tragedy, with horror, with fear, with comedy. So horror comedy really speaks to me, and one of my absolute favorites is Tucker and Dale versus Evil. I mean, that's one of my most absolute favorite movies, and also Final Girls, which was another because it kind of dealt with like the sci-fi aspect of being sucked into a movie, but also having to live through like these horror tropes and to be the final girl. Like I really love like just being able to mix those stories and make it fun, but also terrifying as well, because it's it's horror, but when you really look at the layers and the nuances of the stories, Tucker and Dale versus Evil, it's not just a horror film, but it's about how stereotypes can create these harmful tropes. A lot of people view Native people as being like savages, as brutal, and you see a lot of horror films that really play on those stereotypes, from The Darkness, Tomahawk, I think it's Bone Tomahawk, and you see a lot of those movies where they really play up those stereotypes. Tucker and Dale, also played with those stereotypes of these very suburban kids, privileged, seeing these two country guys and thinking the worst of them, and always thinking that they're the murderers, or they're murderous hillbillies, just all these tropes. And then it comes back on them, like, it's their own stupidity that kind of ends up killing them. My favorite is when the kid goes right in the wood chipper, which, to me, I still, just thinking about it, cannot breathe. It's just so hilarious. Just boom, right through the wood chipper.
And that movie is really funny. That was exactly what I was thinking when I was asking this question, was Tucker and Dale. Caitlin, what about you?
So I really enjoy I guess it's the challenge of secondary world horror, balancing, you know, things that we as audience members are primed to be afraid of versus things that are specific to the setting that we may have to learn as we go along in the story, and how best to do that. Like I really enjoy just any kind of immersive storytelling that it really requires you to get into the world. Like I always wanted to, and finally did get to do this, write like a fantasy, like a farmer's memoir set in a fantasy world. It ended up being for Vampire the Masquerade project, and so it's a vampire farmer, but it's her diary, and it's set up as like, okay, this is what's going on at the farm today, and you're just seeing the horror kind of go by in the background. um, but I really enjoy sort of things like, obviously a lot of us, I'm sure, you know, Alien was very formative to us as horror movies go, and things like that, where a lot of the horror is, it's recognizable. It's blue collar horror of being, knowing that your company has put you in the path of this and is not going to help you, and you're stranded and everything else, but also having to, keep in mind the specific limitations of what additionally is scary about being trapped on a spaceship while this is all happening.
Alien is a great example because it is very traditionally horror, but then at the same time, its sci-fi-ness really comes through it. It does have some like almost class elements in it.
Yeah,
How much
Oh,
the
it does.
company, yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
the
There's
company.
this.
Whew.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
feeling you, Tani. It's not so much a recommendation because I haven't actually read it yet, but something that is high up on my list of things to read is a book called Between Two Fires, which is 1300s plague horror. Yeah,
Ooh,
by Christopher Beelman, I think is the author's name. I've heard extremely good things about it, and it's high up there on the list of next. Um, Slightly, this is into historical horror, like we've mentioned a couple times, that realm of crossover horror.
awesome. That sounds really interesting. Thank you. So one of the things that had kind of come up in some of the responses so far was one of the things I was interested in hearing your thoughts on, which is, in merging or putting horror into these other genre spaces. it has the potential to change how we perhaps are talking about what those genres or even the real or imagined world. And I was wondering, and I'll start with you, Johnny, because you had brought up Tucker and Dale, and so I think this is a good example of this. In what ways does sort of merging these genres or putting them together with horror sort of change or challenge how we think about horror or even the real world to which it may be responding to?
I think it makes us step back, because we're not used to seeing horror presented as a comedy, or we're not seeing horror as presented as a romance. And, there's several movies that have come out, like The Invisible, that were more or less advertised as horror. So you kind of go in expecting a horror film like we traditionally think of horror, but instead you get a story about, just kind of like, I guess you would say, the horrors that life throws at you when you start making the wrong decisions. You had a girl who was kind of a bully. She made a decision to beat this dude up, and he became kind of like stuck between, you know, living and the dead and kind of like a spirit, and being able to follow her, but nobody could see him. And he's seeing all these choices that she was making that just kind of led her down a path that just kept getting darker and darker. And you're like, oh, like this is a horror story, but just not the way that we think of horror. So it really made you stop and think kind of like about the consequences of your own actions. And I think when you're bending genres, and especially with horror, it really makes that obvious. Like it really puts you in these people's shoes as characters. Like you find something that you relate to. You look at a lot of Ghost, for example. The love of her life passed away, but then he was able to come back to her. And it's and the horrors that he was seeing that were all around her, all of these dangerous elements, these spiritual forces. And yet there was nothing he could really do to help her. Like she had to make these decisions for herself as a living person, and there was only so much he could do as a spirit to kind of guide her to make the right decision. And so you kind of start thinking about the real world consequences of your actions in a way. Like even in just typical horror films, you see when you're seeing them getting chased by the monster, and you see them running up the stairs or into a space where there's no exits, and you're like, what are you doing? You kind of think about like, oh, well, what decision would I make in that same situation? And it really challenges like your own instincts, because I think we all kind of like horror because sometimes we can laugh and be like, oh, we would never do that. But at the same time, we don't really know what we're capable of until we're put in a situation. I used to think that, even if I was put in a situation where I had to choose between my own survival and, taking another person's life to ensure my survival, would I be able to do that? And I used to think, no, I think I'd be like, no, no, I can't do it. Just kill me. I offer myself as tribute. Take me out if I don't have to kill you. But, I think the reality is like our survival instincts are so strong that we really don't know. Like we could be the most, just really peace loving. I'm all just like, let's just keep good vibes here kind of person. But in a survival situation, those instincts are going to kick in and you're going to fight. Your body is going to fight. Even like if we're not able to breathe, our body will fight for us try and get that breath. So we don't really know what it is we're capable of until we're put in certain situations. But horror makes you imagine that. It makes you think about it. It makes you think of the consequences of your actions. It makes you more aware of, like, oh, like this may be like a monster, but there are certain real life situations that would mirror the same reactions. Like if you're getting somebody breaks into your house, it's the same as being chased as the ghost face from Scream. So it kind of makes you more aware of the reality of your actions. And it's, I don't know, like, I mean, for me, like horror, especially right now, has been my coping mechanism. I say it's the only thing that stands between me and utter despair. And a lot of that is because there's so much horror that's happening in the world right now, on so many fronts. We're seeing death on such an unimaginable scale. And horror, is kind of an escape from that for a little bit. And it kind of makes you think like, oh, okay, you kind of find ways to kind of release your real life fears in horror. Like you can escape for a moment and you can have these fantastical fears, fantastical um, visions of what you would do if you were up against Ghostface or Frankenstein or Dracula. And for just one moment, you got a release. But then you come back to the real world, but you can still use all these visions that you have of what you would do different, what you would do for your survival. You can bring that into the real world and use that as a coping mechanism for the real life horrors that we face.
Caitlin, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add to what Johnny was saying, or your own
Yeah.
perspective?
This is, it's kind of two things, and one of them dovetails really well that I think that, yeah, when you remix, particularly settings with different rules that we know from, enjoying science fiction without horror, for instance, it makes you, I think, take that step back and start actively trying to anticipate what's going to happen next in the story, as opposed to just trusting that you've seen, that if you're familiar enough with horror, you generally know how the story is going to go. It helps, surprise you or shock you out of your expectations, and might actually help immersion by making you have to think just as much as the characters of, okay, what might happen next? What kind of threat might exist in this situation that I wouldn't normally encounter? On the flip side, and this is more into sort of like horror comedy especially, but imagine like a horror comedy in space. This is great because you're seeing all your favorite tropes from two different genres. It's two great tastes that taste great together. And instead of becoming more anxious about what might happen and more immersed in the horror of it, you can get immersed in the delight and the fun of it, because you're getting to combine two things that normally don't touch. And it's surprising, either in a good or a horrifying way.
I like that idea of surprise in particular. You made me immediately think of the movie Seven, which is a detective story, and you think at the end they're just going to catch the guy and it's fine. And that's not the ending we get at all. He's not fine at the end of that movie. It's pretty dark. It has its own problems, but that was an interesting. When you're telling me about surprise, that's where my brain went. Susan, did you want to jump in with any thoughts here?
Um, wow, there's some good answers there. I think what I'm sticking with the comedy and horror. I find that when you mix things together, like Johnny was sort of mentioning earlier, you get a sort of way to. One thing about horror that I like is that when you mix it with comedy, sometimes you get to punch up. So like I'll go back to my favorite movie, Ready or Not. She's getting married into this very, very wealthy, rich family, and she's just this regular poor girl, and they're out hunting her, which is a comment on society. And she has to deal with that. And instead of it exposes the horror of those who are the oppressors. And it instead of it and because comedy is so biting and it's so sort of analytical, like you don't like to think of comedy as analytical, but it is, because you're searching for sort of discrepancies or things that are strange that can be flipped. That horrific sort of oppression story can be dismantled by using comedy in horror. So I like that. Like even a silly movie like Clue, right? It's making fun of what the upper class would do, and that's a pretty horrific movie if you really think about it. People are getting murdered all over the place. With that game is pretty, you're killing people, someone's a killer. But it dismantles things, and that's what I like about it, that it allows you to take a situation where as Johnny was mentioning, that they're very used to sort of laughing at atrocity. I have that too in my background, where it's like all of these horrible things are happening. Well, if we don't laugh, we're going to cry. So we're going to look at it and we're going to find what's funny about it. And we're going to dismantle what's oppressing us. So that's how I think it changes your viewpoint and allows you to sort of analyze society and analyze different inequalities around you?
That I really like that there's been an interesting focus here on some of the like what you're saying, Susan, in that very good language of like analyzing, the sort of inequalities or problems that the world has that horror can explore, but also those other genres, and comedy perhaps as one that is quite analytical, as you rightly point out, because it can be a genre that is pointing at power and mocking it for presumably our amusement, I suppose, depending on your perspective on comedy. And then maybe wonder, too, and perhaps we could talk a little bit about some of the ways in which horror has borrowed from other genres that specifically have historical roots, like bringing in like the slasher into like a gothic formation, or looking at something like, say, the movie Seven, which is basically just a detective story which happens to have a really horrific element, or other things like that, to sort of very deliberately rip into our sort of notions of our society and power structures that exist. And are there other examples that sort of come to mind to all of you of stories that do that really kind of play around with those different formations to really rip at our society in possibly profound ways, or ways that make you laugh, perhaps also? I realize that's a tough question, but Caitlin, yeah,
Yeah.
you seem like you wanted to go for
Yeah,
it.
I have. It's maybe it's been a while since I've read it, but I think it falls in this category. It's Jeanette Ng's Under the Pendulum Sun, which is about a missionary who goes to fairyland to convert them, and his sister follows after him when he doesn't come back. And it's a very traditional Gothic, crumbling house, secrets, what's real, what's not, perception of reality is in flux, but it's in fairyland. It's very firmly in fairyland, and it's very firmly dealing with issues of colonialism and religious colonialism in particular, and but also these characters' actual faith as well, because we're seeing it from the perspective of the missionary and his sister, and it gets very, very weird because that fairy has a very easily externalizable power of its own. They're coming into an area where they don't feel like they have power, which is a bit of a change, I think, for a lot of missionary stories, and that there are rules that they have to abide by as well, which means that what they, the missionary, the brother, has history going to places in our world and has brought back, assumptions based on that, and now he's being confronted with where those tools that he's picked up really start to break down in ways that they never really worked to begin with, but he didn't have the capability to see. But yeah, so that comes to mind as a fantasy Gothic. But it's interesting because the entire book takes place in fairy, but they came from our world, so it's not entirely fantasy. It's historically based fantasy.
Interesting example. Yeah, that one's interesting. Does anyone else have any thoughts or examples they might want to pull on? Or I suppose also, things you might have done as well could be something to pull from too.
I think one of the things that comes to mind right away for me is there's a film called Rhymes for Young Ghouls, and it deals with the residential boarding schools. It kind of follows a young Native girl back in the 70s, who is on a reservation, and she's just has a really rough upbringing, but at the same time, she's having to deal with trying to dodge what are called Indian agents. And they were agents who were sent into Native communities to make sure that all the kids were out of the community. They would take the kids from their families and take them to these residential boarding schools. And it's a wonderful blend of, this historical reality, which is, based in horror and atrocities, just because of the abuse that was experienced by Native kids in these residential boarding schools. But at the same time, it's kind of like a fairy tale as well, because it goes back and forth between stories that she was told by her grandmother, and she's slowly kind of living this fairy tale out through this story, but just with residential boarding schools. And it's something that was a film that really stuck out to me, because we've been talking a lot about residential boarding schools, recently in the news. It's really come to light for mainstream. But for Native people, it's always been something that was told in whispers. My grandparents were survivors of residential boarding schools, and so it was a history that I knew in my family. But to see it in film and to kind of be able to deal with this horrific event in history, but also kind of tie it to our folklore and the stories that we tell, was really beautiful to see. And the acting was just superb in this film because you're watching it and you get humor, you get action, you get you get all these bits and pieces, and they blend together so wonderful. And it's so reflective of how a lot of indigenous communities kind of deal with horror and with some of the harder things that we face in life is with comedy. So you get all of these different elements, and it really showcases that humor, the resiliency. It's a real reflective of how our ancestors have been able to, survive colonization in general and all of the atrocities that came with that. But it's a wonderful film. And, he also did a follow-up, which is a zombie film, which is called Blood Quantum. And, it's one of my favorite zombie movies right now, not just because of natives, not just because I'm biased, but, also because it plays with this idea that, indigenous people are immune for some reason. And, it kind of goes back to blending kind of like the fantasy, but also with science, because, when geneticists are studying indigenous DNA, there are some really unique genetic markers that are only found in different indigenous people from around the world. And, they constantly talk about, how these markers are very specific to, different lands and different places. So it kind of ties back into that. And also just kind of the irony of us being immune to this virus when, historically it was a lot of these viruses like smallpox that decimated a lot of our communities. So I really love Blood Quantum, just because of the storytelling, just because it also challenges the idea of Native identity as well, because we deal, with our identity is socio-political, but so much of what people believe of our identity is that it's only based on blood, and where you basically have to carry cards that give us a degree of Indian blood. And so, it's like you're 1/4 or 3/35 or, 1/826, and people are like, well, how Indian does that make you? Are you Indian enough? So for us, it works on so many different fronts because it makes us challenge the notion of indigenous identity as well. But Blood Quantum and Rhymes for Young Ghouls, are absolutely two of my favorite movies, just because they deal with horror, but also, like some of the Native history, and also, just being able to bring in all these different elements of humor, of drama. It's truly a very unique genre bending experience.
And I think the director of that is Jeff Barnaby, if I'm
Yes,
correct. And he's and I may get the pronunciation wrong, Mi'kmaq?
Micmac.
Micmac. Okay, yeah. So check that out. Definitely, strongly recommend. I haven't seen the Rhymes for Young Ghouls, but Blood Quantum is chef's kiss. It's so good. Susan, do you want to jump in? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna sort of go away from actual textual or visual things that you can consume, because my history, like, I'm from the Caribbean, I'm from Trinidad originally, and so a lot of the horror that I come from is folkloric horror, to jump off what Johnny was saying. And that sort of evolved from colonization, of the mixture of slaves, West African enslaved people being brought over, and Indian indentured servants being brought over, and that mixing with European colonizers' cultures. And a lot of the horror that we have, it's interesting because people view horror differently. And, growing up, we would be like, okay, well, that woman is like a sukunyant, which is like a vampire, and she just lives down the road. Or, this person put a curse on me. And so my experience of horror, and history, sort of melding with history, is kind of different than what we experience in media or in books. It's something that exists all around me all the time. And I'm not necessarily, it's not something that you have to fight. It's just there. And I think that's because of the history. I also think that folklore itself comes from, cautionary tales that people have been told. We have a character called the Dwen, which is a child who has died, who has not been baptized. And where that came from was that the colonizers wanted people to convert to Christianity. And so they would say, well, if you don't convert to Christianity, your child will not rest if they pass away. And so I'm not sure where I'm ending off with this topic, but just that his history and folklore and actual circumstances have really sort of changed my view of what horror is. And I think a story of a child haunting you would be pretty terrifying generally, but that's the story I grew up with as a little kid. Like, I heard that all the time. So it's affected my perception of horror. I don't know if that's the answer to your question. I just wanted to say that.
No, I think that's a perfectly fine answer. That actually leads me to what would be a related side to this, which would be kind of how you might approach these things as writers and creatives, or at least how you might see other people approach it that interests you, in doing some of these blendings of genres and merging horror into other quote unquote traditional genres. And I suppose, Susan, might be an interesting point. Is that something specifically for you that you draw on folklore in your own writing and sort of look at that meaning as you were describing?
Yeah, that's what I'm into right now at the moment. I'm really interested in sort of, because we've been othered, because growing up, or when I was in school, I took English literature. I was an English major, so I was, I always read books where the Eastern people were othered or darker skinned people were othered, and it didn't really center me. So now I'm really, really interested in taking those folkloric stories and changing what's monstrous and humanizing the monster. And so instead of it being, oh, this is horrific, it's no, we're seeing it from the monster's point of view, and maybe these other things are horrific. So flipping the trope. That's what I absolutely love that. And I know there are fairy tales that we've grown up with, but I've been doing it with my own folklore because I haven't seen it done before. So yes.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm glad to hear it. I kind of already knew the answer, but that's because I've read some of the stuff you've written. So
that's what I write. So.
yeah. If I could to Caitlin, because I know you had done science fiction merged with horror with your newest work. What about you? How did you kind of approach that?
So I tend to approach it from on a craft level of like, I'm curious as like what information do I need to give the audience for them to be able to follow along with me? So like the Luminous Dead is set on a future colony world that's a mineral extraction world, and it starts already in the cave. Like it's science fiction, but you're not going to get a lot about galactic politics. You're not going to get about how the spaceships work. You'll get enough about how the suit that the main character is working, because she's going to be living in it for the next month or more. And you get what her economic and social relationship is with her employer, because that's the central relationship of the story. But beyond that, I sort of just stripped out a lot of what would be, the fun bits you get to learn about with science fiction, because I was trying to tell a horror story. And I found that the more you have to explain the world or the setting, the premise, the more it makes the reader the less scared the reader tends to be. You can use that to your advantage, because then you can lull them into a false sense of security and then really hit them with some freaky stuff. I tend to try and just kind of streamline it as much as possible, so that you don't think that you have a handle on, you have a handle on the world, but you haven't spent half a book learning the world. You're just like, okay, we're in it. I know what I need to know. I can move forward with this. And that, lets you get to that balance I was talking about like horror things that are always scary to most audiences and horror that is specific to the setting. And I think that does extend to not just like science fiction or secondary world horror. I think that's something that like you know, Jordan Peele or even, you know, Susan here would have to, you know, keep in mind of like, okay, well, how much am I going to educate you before I can scare you? You know, do you need to be educated about this? How much can I dump you in the deep end? And it's just it's a fun place to explore and just kind of try and figure out just the right amount of comfort and familiarity versus discomfort and newness and alienation and stuff. This is less about the genre bending, but goes into how I write horrors. That I think is not necessarily wasn't the dominant way of doing it, although I think it's becoming much more popular. Is so as someone I am neurodivergent, have some mental illnesses, centering that is actually still being scary, not because it's not scary to other people. It's that humanizing or centering the quote unquote monster thing of, guess what? If you're dealing with hallucinations, that's not fun. And it in fact can be one of the scariest things in your situation. So with the Luminous Dead again, there was a point in its development where they had very traditional monsters that chased the main character through the cave, very Descent-like. And my editor at the time was like, well, what if we just take out the monsters? And I was like, well, what do you mean take out the monsters? The monsters are cool and they're half the book. And he's like, yeah, but I bet you could still do it. I think you should try and do it. So we did it, but the way I had to approach it was, you know, there's a way to tell the story in which it's all in her head is the most disappointing thing possible. Feels like a cop-out, feels like we're just like, okay, none of it was real, whatever. There's also a way to tell the story where the worst possible option is that it's all in her head because it still has actual impacts on her life. And that was the route we decided to go. And it's something that since that book, I've ended up drawing on for most of my other work of just like, you know, interior experience of being in a given situation, of not being able to trust yourself, of having to learn how to trust yourself and when to trust yourself is just as interesting and scary as a monster lurking in, you know, in the hallway.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Caitlin. Johnny, I will just note that I was thinking when I was going to direct this question to you that I believe on A Tribe Called Geek, there's an article called The Happiest Place on Earth, but not for everyone, I think, which you did not write, but was making me think a lot about some of the horrors that sort of layered on the real world already, because that article is specifically about the history of like anti-Indigenous racism in the very long history of Disney and some of its representations of people. But I was hoping you could kind of, as someone who's sort of interested in horror and is watching these things, are there other kinds of interesting strategies that you've seen people do, or that in your own work that you've been exploring as a journalist and so on, that just you think are really cool and interesting to kind of explore?
Yes, so I love horror, and for the longest time there hasn't been a lot of native horror. And we always ask ourselves why, and we kind of joke around with it. It's because when things are terrible or scary things happen to us, or if we're confronted with, hauntings or different spirits in our communities, most of the time we know how to deal with it. We go to our elders, we go to our aunties or our grandmas, and, they whip out the sage or they whip out their prayers, and boom, problem solved. And so, and we also just, we are taught to respect, spirits and to believe that they're a natural part of the world. Like when we go and we visit other lands, like if I were to travel to South Dakota, I always take tobacco, and wherever it is I'm visiting, I leave that tobacco as an offering, to the spirits that reside on that land. Like, thank you for letting me be a guest here. And, we try not to misbehave on that land because you don't know the rules. You don't know what these spirits are going to deem as acceptable behavior or not. So you kind of be on your best behavior. And, so I really love that we're starting to see kind of like this renaissance of Indigenous horror. And what I really love is that they play around with, as Kaylin was talking, the idea that the worst case scenario is that it is actually happening, that these actually are the spirits, and or that it is actually just something that is in our head. There's a lot of stories that kind of deal with that play back and forth. And two of the greatest examples I could think of right now is Alatso, which is a great story by Darcy Little Badger, where it deals where she's trying to uncover the murderer of her cousin. And, in order to do that, she has to communicate with spirits. And her family has the knowledge to do that. So, this book is going through how our ancestral knowledge can play into, this real world. But for non-natives who are looking in, it's something that's so fantastical and they don't believe her. And, the same with Stephen Graham Jones, The Only Good Indians, and Mapping the Interior. Those are two stories that really play into this idea of being able to, really just, can you really trust yourself to know that this is really what you're experiencing or not? And that this is what it's tied to. And, The Only Good Indians, is is still terrifying. I still have nightmares and I still, kind of trip out about it. But, and not so much because of the creature feature, but because of that, the human horror. And again, it goes back to, like thinking about the consequences of your actions and the impact that they have, maybe not immediately, but down the road. And not only on you, but the people around you. And, that's something that with dealing with horror and, just how do we deal with this as natives? These are things that we talk about and we tell these stories to our kids as cautionary tales, because as you can see, like in Disney, there's a long history of anti-indigeneity there. We're still seeing, our culture being mocked, being, just used as kind of like a political punching bag, in every little thing, not just politics, but when we're looking at public health, during this pandemic, a lot of our communities that requested PPE were instead sent body bags. So there's real life horrors and inequalities that we're dealing with. And we kind of turn that inward to how do we cope in creative ways? How do we get people to understand the horror of these situations? Because there's not a framework for a lot of Native history in this country, and a lot of people don't really know like how our communities are, aside from like the stereotypes or what they're shown in the media. They really don't understand the horror, and they really don't understand why certain things are so harmful and bad. So, I think the challenge with Native storytellers is trying to bring these issues to the forefront in a way that non-natives and people not from our communities can understand and relate to on that very basic human level, without it being preachy or without it trying to vilify, other people, that trying to bring the focus back onto what the real issue is. And I think that's a really hard challenge, because I think anytime, marginalized people bring up the issues that we face in the real world, it's automatically like, well, you're just playing the victim card. Why can't you just get over this? And it's kind of trying to make people understand that a lot of these horrors, they're not something that's relegated to the past. Like, they're still happening, and they start manifesting very differently as time goes on. Like Peter Pan, for example, is, you see kind of like the stereotypical native savages, and people think, oh, they're just doing the little, what makes the red man red, and they're literally red. But there's a lot of horror when you look at that, and just when you're seeing like Tiger Lily being taken captive and held on the boat, and her people constantly being abused, not just by Captain Hook but by the Lost Boys. They're being terrorized by all of these different entities in Neverland, but yet they're still portrayed as kind of like the villain in a way, as the mischief themselves. And, nobody else is the problem but them for being in that situation. So, it's a challenge. And I love that natives are kind of stepping back into horror, because I think it brings us back to these very primal feelings and very primal understanding of, survival. And it's just something that for a lot of people, it's also fun. So I love like this resurgence of like indigenous horror, and being able to relate it to contemporary issues that, you know, we see in the mainstream, not just in our Native communities.
I'm right there with you. I'm loving what's happening in horror at the moment. There's a lot of really cool stuff from people on this panel and not that is just well worth reading. So we have no time, and I was going to ask a fun question, but we have no time. So instead, if I could have folks let everyone know where they could find you in your work, if you've got a work coming out, you know, recently or whatever, that would be cool. If you haven't already mentioned it, there's something kind of in the immediate horizon. And I'll just go down my list here. We'll start with you, Susan. Where can folks find you? Do you have something coming semi-soon that you could recommend?
Well, my last story came out in March, and that's actually about the folkloric character I talked about here. It's called Dwen. It's in the dark. It's written in Trinidadian Creole English, so that's fun. What else? My book is about to be on sub, so that's really what I'm focused on at the moment right now, polishing it up because it goes out next week. And other than that, I will be around doing things with FiaCon and not FiaCon, the Ignite Awards. The announcements should be coming up, and I am working on doing a workshop for BIPOC writers, but I can't say the name yet, but it will be coming in July. So, and also you can find me on Twitter. I think I put my handle there. So that's where I am most of the time.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Susan. And Johnny, what about you?
Well, everyone can find me on Twitter at Johnny J, JOHNNIE JAE. And you can also find me every Wednesday and Saturday night on Twitter. I host Whistling in the Night, a Twitter space for the strange and unusual. So if you want to share your paranormal experiences or encounters with UFOs, join us every Wednesday and Saturday at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It's an open forum, so everyone's welcome to share. And also, you know, if you guys can, I have a link on my Twitter to vote for me in the Tonka Fun Blanket Design Contest. I am an artist as well, so, you know, I'd really appreciate your vote. But other than that, just find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Johnny J.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Johnny. And Caitlin, what about you?
You can find me on Twitter at C_Starling. It's SEE_Starling. And I am more or less active there, less active in the near future because I'm expecting a kid. So also no work coming out in the immediate future either. But I did have a book come out in October, which is The Death of Jane Lawrence, which if you like your gothic horror with horrifying 1800 surgical practices and or calculus and or cocaine and or ritual magic, I got you covered. And if you're in the UK, there's a UK edition of that coming out in September.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you, everybody. My panelists, you were fantastic. I had to ask very few questions because you all just had much to say, so thank you. And thank you so much, everybody who has been watching. Really, really appreciate it. I hope you all have a great rest of your con. You have a great night. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, or I guess technically possibly Monday for some people. So take care, and thanks again.
Thank you. This was great.
Hi.
Everybody.